It was many and many a year ago, in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And this maiden she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. I was a child and she was a child in this kingdom by the sea. But we loved with a love that was more than love, I and my Annabel Lee, with a love that the winged seraphs of heaven coveted her and me. And this was the reason that long ago, in this kingdom by the sea, a wind blew out of a cloud, chilling my beautiful Annabel Lee, so that her high-born kinsman came and bore her away from me, to shut her up in a sepulchre in this kingdom by the sea. The angels, not half so happy in heaven, went envying her and me. Yes, that was the reason, as all men know, in this kingdom by the sea, that the wind came out of the cloud by night, chilling and killing my Annabel Lee. But our love, it was stronger by far than the love of those who were older than we, of many far wiser than we, and neither the angels in heaven above, nor the demons down under the sea, can ever dissever my soul from the soul of the beautiful Annabel Lee. For the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And the stars never rise, but I feel the bright eyes of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And so all the night tide I lie down by the side of my darling, my life and my bride, in her sepulchre there by the sea, in her tomb by the sounding sea. So, this is Annabel Lee by Edgar Allan Poe. You may know this poem as the piece that Noah Centineo's character plagiarized in To All the Boys I've Loved Before too, but more likely you just know it as Edgar Allan Poe's most famous love poem. But is it really a love poem? Let's talk about it. As with any good poem, there's a lot to unpack here, but I'm just going to touch on the points that strike me the most. If you were just skimming this poem, or maybe just faintly listening to it in the background, you'd probably take it as just your standard boilerplate love poem. After all, the words love and loved appear in the poem 8 times when taken together, so I definitely get the sense that the speaker most certainly loves Annabel Lee. That's easy enough to see, isn't it? In fact, love might not even be a strong enough word. Infatuated or obsessed with might be even more apt. But what about Annabel? Did she love the speaker? Well, conveniently, we don't know, because she's dead. And to that point, there's a lot we don't know about the titular Annabel. The poem is supposedly about her, but is it really? All we really know is she was young. The speaker calls her a child, as he was a child too. And forgive me for gendering the speaker, but I do get the impression they're a man, if only based on vibes. But what I'm getting at is, for someone who apparently loved Annabel Lee so much, he sure seems incapable of really remembering anything about her. Didn't they share any memories together? They must have if they were so in love, right? This is a moment where telling versus showing is actually an effective route because it emphasizes how our speaker here might be an unreliable narrator. And there's even more to it than that. The way the speaker says Annabel dies is rather peculiar. He ascribes the death to the jealousy of the angels. He says the heavenly beings were so covetous of his and Annabel's love that they took her life. Just one problem with that though, that's not a very angelic thing to do, is it? Not very heavenly at all to covet. That's literally one of the 10 commandments, thou shalt not covet. So on paper, things really aren't adding up. It sounds like the speaker is almost trying to convince himself of his own narrative, really emphasized by the 3rd and 4th lines of the 4th stanza. Yes, that was the reason, as all men know, in this kingdom by the sea. Listen to him, he's basically saying, oh yeah, everyone knows Annabel died because we were just so in love, duh. Who are you trying to fool here, buddy? The speaker's true relationship with Annabel is also emphasized in the 3rd stanza. When Annabel dies, her high-born kinsmen come and collect her to put her up in a sepulchre. But why would they take her away from the man she loved? Why wouldn't he have any part in her funeral? You could argue that maybe they were too young, or that the speaker wasn't high enough in class or social status to publicly be with Annabel. But is it possible that Annabel took her own life to get away from the speaker, or more likely, the speaker was so obsessed and deranged that he killed Annabel himself? And perhaps compounding on the obsession is the guilt, which adds an extra motivating factor in his choice to sleep at her tomb every night. One last thing that, in my opinion, calls Annabel's death into question is the rhythm. Credit for the scansion goes to Poetry Corner podcast. Notice how every use of the word love or loved is on a stressed syllable, which really emphasizes the speaker's obsession here, and how he's really trying to convince himself, the reader, or both, But more interestingly, notice line 15, the third line of the third stanza. This is where the speaker explains how Annabel died. A wind blew out of a cloud, chilling my beautiful Annabel Lee. Setting aside how vague the content of the line really is, notice cloud followed by chilling. This is the only moment in the poem where one stressed syllable directly follows another. It almost feels like an error, doesn't it? Like the narrative, much like the structure, is briefly slipping from the speaker's hands. But as always, you can tell me if I'm reading too much into things here. I'm utterly interested to know your thoughts. But in my opinion, Annabel Lee proves itself among the best kinds of literature. The more you put into it, the more you get out of it. It definitely cracks the top 3 of Edgar Allan Poe's best short pieces, in my opinion. Yeah, that's right, I'm not ranking these from worst to best or best to worst, I'm ranking them randomly, and I'm sure everyone will be very chill and not at all bothered by that. You might also disagree as to which 10 pieces I consider Poe's most famous, and if that's the case, let me know. Also, just so you're aware, I'm going to be operating under the assumption that you know the gist of these stories, and I apologize if you don't. But for now, let's move on to The Telltale Heart. This story has a killer opening. It reads, "True, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I had been, and am, but why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all, with the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad?" The disease in particular really raises questions, but more than anything, if you had no context about this story, you would have to wonder, maybe he's right? The obvious line of thinking is, oh, this guy is definitely insane, but part of you would still wonder, maybe he is in communication with something from the beyond. This story is, in my opinion, creepier than many of Poe's others. To refresh your memory, the story's narrator is stalking this old man, preparing to kill him, and every night around midnight, he messes with the latch on the old man's door and peers his head in to see him sleeping. That very notion honestly sends shivers down my spine. Can you imagine someone violating your space like that, coming in to just stare at you night after night? And Poe does write it as a violation. Put your mind in the gutter for a moment as I read this quote. "And every night, about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it, oh so gently, and then, when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern. All closed, so that no light shone out, and then I thrust in my head. Oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me about an hour to place my whole head within the opening so far that I could see him as he lay upon his bed. Ha! Would a madman have been so wise as this? It makes me so uncomfortable. It's a masterfully written tension builder. It kind of surprises me how short this story is overall, especially its most iconic moment. A lot of people forget that the story focuses so much on the victim and his one discolored eye, and less on the titular telltale heart. And the focus on the heart makes sense, the premise is so creative and eerie. And when the story ends, you're still confident that the speaker is just insane. And yet, at the same time, you kind of wonder, was the heart truly beating? Surely not, right? But with the way the story ends, there almost is room for doubt. It's fascinating. On another note, a lot of Poe's shorts aren't really character-driven, but more driven by circumstance. As good as these stories are on the conceptual and technical level, most people don't really read them for the characters. As with many short story writers of his time, Poe was more interested in crazy premises. But here, the narrator's personality really comes through, which is fun. For its eeriness and its horrifyingly creative premise, I'm going to put this one at number 4, just below Annabel Lee. And with that, let's move into The Murders in the Rue Morgue. For such an interesting story, it sure gets off to a boring start, and it's a well-written opening from a technical standpoint, but it's really not very gripping by today's standards. It's sort of just this really long monologue about checkers and chess and how analytical a person can be. I'm not sure this one would have seen publication in the modern day in its current state. Granted, you might think it's unfair to judge this story by today's standards, especially when Poe is kind of credited as the inventor of detective stories in general. It's pretty widely known that Sherlock Holmes and Hercule Poirot were inspired by Dupin. Maybe it's not fair to say he missed some of the marks of the genre when he was literally inventing the genre. He didn't have any standard to go off of, he was setting it. Still, beyond the story's opening, I honestly do kind of feel like the narrator gets in the way of the story. Even so, the mystery is honestly a really good one. Dupin lays out the premise pretty clearly. It appears to me that this mystery is considered insoluble for the very reason which should cause it to be regarded as easy of solution. I mean, for the outre character of its features. The police are confounded by the seeming absence of motive, not for the murder itself, but for the atrocity of the murder. They are puzzled, too, by the seeming impossibility of reconciling the voices heard in contention with the facts that no one was discovered upstairs but the assassinated Mademoiselle L'Espanaye, and that there were no means of egress without notice of the party ascending. The wild disorder of the room, the corpse thrust with the head downward up the chimney, the frightful mutilation of the body of the old lady, these considerations, with those just mentioned, and others which I need not mention, have sufficed to paralyze the powers by putting completely at fault the boasted acumen of the government agents. What a premise! I will say this is a unique mystery in more ways than one. Dupin can only solve it by detaching any idea of humanity from the culprit. I wish you, therefore, to discard from your thoughts the blundering idea of motive engendered in the brains of the police. I don't know that any average reader would be able to solve it on their own. I don't know if they have enough context. If you didn't know, the culprit is an orangutan. But still, it's pretty gratifying how Poe makes everything come together, even if it would have been impossible for anyone to guess. There's also some debate, as is the case with many Poe works, as to whether there is a racist subtext here. Some readers and scholars, past and present, take the orangutan to be a racist analog for an escaped black slave in the US, effectively making the story one about how freed black men could and would wreak havoc on helpless white women. It's white supremacist stuff, you get it. On the other hand, some folks read Rue Morgue as a cautionary tale about the dangers of colonization, how plundering the resources of another nation and taking things that don't belong to you will always come back to bite you. But then, of course, as Freud said, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, and in this case, the orangutan might just be an orangutan. We'll unfortunately never know for sure, but I honestly think it's an interesting and worthy debate regardless. Please let me know what you think. I should make it clear that I like every piece in this top 10, I really do. They are all still read today for a reason. But one of these has to be at the bottom, and for me personally, it's going to have to be The Murders in the Rue Morgue. It has its redeeming factors, but it just doesn't hold up compared to the genre as we know it today, and compared to other works on this list, I sort of found it the least enjoyable to reread. With that, we'll move into The Fall of the House of Usher, which has a much stronger opening than Rue Morgue. During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself as the shades of the evening drew on within view of the melancholy house of Usher. The first sentence is lengthy, which is risky, but when you can pull it off, it really works. This sentence sets the stage with remarkable skill while also planting seeds in our minds. What is the House of Usher? Why is it melancholy? Great opener. The story is also a masterclass in both setting and symbolism. Setting is always something I've been pretty bad at, so it's helpful to see how Poe makes this setting feel alive, literally. One of my favorite tidbits is how the speaker, multiple times, compares the house's windows to eyes, evoking a feeling of being watched. Fall of the House of Usher carries with it a theme that we see over and over again in literature, that being nothing can ever stay the same, everything changes, preservation is impossible, or as William Butler Yeats and Chinua Achebe so aptly put it, things fall apart. A theme so broad opens itself up to a lot of more specific interpretations. For example, in considering Poe's own time, there were multiple revolutions across Europe throughout the 1830s, and any of these might have been applied to the House of Usher as a metaphor for how regimes ultimately fall, both with drama and with ignominy. Looking at the story from a modern lens, I can't help feeling it has something to say about eugenics. You can tell me I'm way off the mark with this one, and I'll understand, but one of the explicit causes of the fall of the Usher family is inbreeding, their desire to keep their bloodline pure. That idea of purity in blood is something we see today, mostly on the fringes, but unfortunately approaching a mainstream. The comfort, though, that Poe gives us with this story is that such aspirations ultimately cause a system's own undoing. The inability to accept difference or diversity ultimately leads to a fall, a very tremendous fall. And like many totalitarian dictators or fascistic strongmen, Roderick is utterly paranoid, and that paranoia too contributes to his fall. However, Roderick's paranoia is justified in one regard at least. When his sister Madeline dies, Roderick and the narrator put her in a coffin and behind an iron door. Roderick knows, as it turns out, that they actually entombed her alive, and she later breaks free of both the coffin and the door with superhuman strength. But this is all part of the symbolism. Madeline was a product of inbreeding too, and it's implied that she and Roderick had an incestuous relationship of their own. We can read Madeline's character as a representation of how skeletons cannot stay in the closet forever. No matter how a powerful entity may try to bury their worst attributes, they will always return to haunt and doom the bid to maintain power, wealth, and purity. As the narrator puts it, Roderick became a victim to the terrors he had anticipated. And the same is true for all Ushers, all Okonkwo's, all Ozymandiases, all people, and all things. This story also gets points for having a banger poem in it, but mostly it's great for how weird and bold it is and how relevant it remains. Even so, as with Rue Morgue, some of these stories have to fill up the bottom space here, and so despite its greatness, Usher comes in at number 8 for me, which really is just a testament to how excellent the other 7 works are ahead of it. Now let's talk about The Masque of the Red Death. It's one of Poe's shorter stories, and yet it feels so incredibly dense. This story also feels painfully relevant today. A powerful leader, Prince Prospero, trying to ignore the reality of a plague upon his country, while also reveling in his wealth, luxury, and power with his friends? Where have I heard that before? Much like House of Usher, we can also interpret this story as a warning for those hoping to perpetuate their power. Things fall apart. Symbolizing this message is, of course, the clock in the Black Room. The clock keeps on ticking, and every time it strikes the hour, even the musicians have to pause to let it ring. Much like the Red Death, which is arguably a metaphor for death itself, the clock, the passage of time, is impossible to ignore, despite anyone's best efforts. Sorry, this quote is long, but it's just so good. It was in this apartment also that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang. And when the minute hand made the circuit of the face and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that, at each lapse of an hour, the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance to hearken to the sound, and thus the waltzers perforce ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company. And while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows as if in confused reverie or meditation. But when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled as if at their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows each to the other that the next chiming of the clock should produce in them no similar emotion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embrace 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, there came yet another chiming of the clock, and then were the same disconcert and tremulousness and meditation as before. But even when the clock gives out, who survives? The Red Death, who held illimitable dominion over all, as the story says, even over time itself. The message here feels quite clear. No one is above time, and certainly no one is above death, no matter how much earthly power they have. The occasional change in verb tense is weird, but otherwise this story just bangs. For me, it's gonna fill my number 6 spot. And that'll take us into The Oval Portrait. I had actually never read this one before this video, and it's kind of an interesting case. It's a rare instance where I almost feel Poe's work should be longer, but at the same time, I'm glad it's not bloated or overly written. What surprised me is that The Oval Portrait is actually a frame story, meaning we start the story from one point of view and then we zoom into someone else's point of view, as if zooming in on a framed portrait until the frame disappears and the new image becomes the story. The ultimate irony of The Oval Portrait is, of course, in the portrait and its history. We're told that those who saw the painting of the beautiful young woman saw what love the artist must have had for her when, in reality, he was completely neglecting her to focus on the painting. In some ways, the story almost reads like a feminist work, reminding readers how women are worked, used, and exploited to bring about amazing things but don't receive any credit for it. To quote the story, "And in sooth some who beheld the portrait spoke of its resemblance in low words, as of a mighty marvel and a proof not less of the power of the painter than of his deep love for her whom he depicted so surpassingly well." And as I said, this is where the irony comes in. While the artist is so focused on the portrait of his wife, he fails to see her ailing health. The artist screams that the painting is life itself, only to find his wife dead. It's as if the painting, and by extension the painter, sucked the life out of a beautiful, happy young woman, all for the sake of a piece of art. And was it worth it? I would say the narrative argues no, even despite the tremendous effect the painting has on the story's first narrator. All in all, this story will take the number 7 spot here, in spite of its length. Maybe it's because it's the piece I've most newly read of Poe's, but I know I'm going to be thinking about it for a while. As an aside, the oval portrait reminds me of Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Birthmark, another Gothic short story about a man who's dedicated to his craft and who mistreats and causes the death of his lover. And funnily enough, these stories were published about a year apart from each other. But from there, let's talk about The Black Cat. The story opens in a similar way to that of The Telltale Heart. There's also the symbol of the odd eye, which we also see in The Telltale Heart. And there's the sound that comes from beneath some construction where a dead body is hidden. I'm starting to think these stories were written by the same author. Nah, but in all seriousness, these are not exclusively Poe things. Characters with one or two discolored or wounded eyes, as well as hidden bodies and unstable narrators, are tropes as old as time. The Black Cat is a pretty interesting case study in writing an unlikable character. If you've ever been in a literary workshop or circles online, you've probably heard that your characters are supposed to be likable. But are they? Consider some of the most famous books of all time. Do they all have likable characters? The one that always comes to mind for me is Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. I hate that guy, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. Likewise, I hate the narrator of The Black Cat. His first major action in the story is committing violence against a pet cat whom he claims to love. There's really kind of no coming back from that as a character. So how does Poe still make the story readable? Well, for one thing, he opens with strong intrigue. We find out that there's reason to suspect the narrator might be mad, so immediately we question why. What's more, the speaker tells us he's set to die the very next day. Again, we have to ask why. As we continue reading, hoping to find the answers to these questions, we come to know the speaker as a longtime animal lover, with a myriad of pets. Look at how many animals he's taken care of. He can't be that bad. But then it turns out he is that bad. Even if he was drunk, I don't think that excuses taking a knife to a cat, right? But at that point, we still want to know why he thinks he's crazy and why he's going to soon die. And from there, the story only gets more intriguing. The speaker finds another cat whom he wants to purchase, only for the property owner to say they've never seen it before in their life. That might sound kind of cliche, but it is pretty undeniably intriguing. I should also note, you're obviously supposed to hate the narrator of this story. It's one thing when an author makes their main character unlikable on purpose, versus on accident. It's kind of hard to compare this one to Telltale Heart given their similar features. I honestly like them both a lot, but I'm ultimately going to give the edge to Telltale for just being a little creepier in my opinion. That'll put The Black Cat at number 5, but honestly, if it didn't go against the video's premise, I would probably just rank them equally in a tie. Also, as a very late correction, you may remember when I said in my The Most Annoying Tropes in Horror Writing video that The Black Cat was an example of a story that doesn't make reference to its storyness. Well, that was a lie. From the very get-go, the narrator says he's writing the story ahead of his death sentence. Whoops, egg on my face. Next up, we'll go with The Pit and the Pendulum. What first jumps out at me here is the artistic depiction of time. Quote, "In one of my prison's panels, a very singular figure riveted my whole attention. It was the painted figure of time as he is commonly represented, save that, in lieu of a scythe, he held what, at a casual glance, I supposed to be the pictured image of a huge pendulum, such as we see on antique clocks. And much like Red Death, one of the big ideas here seems to be our inability to escape time's ticking, the swinging of the pendulum, as it were. For us, it's either the pit or the pendulum, and as the speaker points out, neither fate is particularly attractive. In some ways, the speaker's fate does kind of seem like a metaphor for aging, given the way his body's faculties gradually and continually fail. And when the speaker does manage to actually escape the pendulum, he tragically still cannot escape his doom, as the prison wall pushes him toward the edge of the pit. Quote, "This was a lesson which I took desperately to heart. My every motion was undoubtedly watched. Free, I had but escaped death in one form of agony to be delivered unto worse than death in some other." Or at least, that's what I would think, if it weren't for the fact that the speaker is saved at the last second by General Lasalle and the French army. And don't get me wrong, I'm glad the narrator survives given he was unjustly imprisoned and tortured by the Spanish Inquisition. But doesn't that kind of undermine everything we just went through? All the symbolism and allegory? Then again, maybe it's not an allegory at all. Maybe it's just supposed to be a crazy, messed up story, and one that actually ends on a happy note, which is uncharacteristic of Poe's works. There's this little article from Schmoop titled "What's Up with the Ending?" and it acknowledges how the ending does seem to undermine the narrator's previous thoughts. To quote the article, "Does this lessen or cheapen the power of our hero's thoughts? Heck no, in fact, it's what makes it possible for us to even know his thoughts. If he hadn't been rescued, our protagonist could never have told his story. Just as he's given life, he's given a voice as well." And if this were a true story, then sure, but it's not. Pit and the Pendulum is a work of fiction, and there are many fictional works where narrators tell their stories from beyond the grave. The fact that such a thing is possible is what gave the Pit and the Pendulum its tension. Just because a narrator is narrating a story to us doesn't mean they're okay, physically or otherwise. The premise is horrifying, for sure. But like Rue Morgue, it kind of takes a while to get going. There is also a nice mystery element here, but I don't think that quite makes up for the pacing. But I do want to highlight this quote. "Yet not for a moment did I suppose myself actually dead. Such a supposition, notwithstanding what we read in fiction, is altogether inconsistent with real existence." Bars, Edgar Allan Poe, bars. Still, this one will come in at number 9. And that just leaves our number 1 and 2 spots. And our first piece on the top 2, taking either the first or second spot, will be the Cask of Amontillado. Compared to Poe's other works, this one is much more dialogue heavy, and I honestly like that a lot. Don't get me wrong, Poe writes beautifully, and even without dialogue he can craft unique and gripping passages. But dialogue is just such an effective way to net an audience. The Cask of Amontillado just proves that to me. We get more of Fortunato and Montresor than maybe any other Poe characters on this list, and at the same time there is still so much we don't know about them. What was Fortunato's crime? What were the 1,000 injuries Montresor mentions at the story's opening? Just being annoying? We may never know, and with that question in mind, these lines of dialogue particularly jumped out to me on this reading. In this moment, Fortunato is nearly, for lack of a better phrase, bricked up completely, and he lets go of any denial and hope. He realizes that Montresor is very seriously going to leave him in the catacombs. He says, "For the love of God, Montresor." And Montresor replies, "Yes, for the love of God." Is that to say Montresor thinks he's acting in God's best interest by taking his revenge on Fortunato? Does he believe he's doing God a favor by killing Fortunato so cruelly? And again, in wondering that, I simply must know what exactly Fortunato did to merit this, and it's a deft move on Poe's part to not tell us. Usually, writers shouldn't withhold from their audiences, but here, it really makes a reader's mind run wild. Depending on the circumstances, maybe there's a world where Montresor is justified. But more likely, and just based on the way he narrates and his general vibe, he's just super petty and evil. The dialogue is also very important because Montresor is clearly reveling in his back and forth with Fortunato. He's so smug as he gives Fortunato multiple chances to back out, but knows that the wine connoisseur won't take them. Then there's the repeated mention of another character, Lucchesi. Montresor mentions Lucchesi multiple times, saying he can identify the Amontillado if Fortunato isn't feeling up to the task, but this too is just another way to goad him into his doom. This all culminates in the story's ending after the "for the love of God" exchange. Fortunato? No answer. I called again. Fortunato? No answer still. I thrust a torch through the remaining aperture and let it fall within. There came forth in return only a jingling of the bells. My heart grew sick. It was the dampness of the catacombs that made it so. I hastened to make an end of my labor. I forced the last stone into its position. I plastered it up. Against the new masonry, I re-erected the old rampart of bones. For the half of a century, no mortal has disturbed them. In pace requiescat. To me, it seems clear that Montresor really wanted Fortunato to answer him, and he's unsatisfied that all he hears is the jingling of bells. He really wanted to relish his revenge, and the fact that Fortunato remains silent might seem like a slap in the face. Notice how Montresor even says, "My heart grew sick." Ultimately, he attributes it to the dampness of the catacombs, but I'm tempted to read it as his dissatisfaction or maybe even a twinge of guilt as his plan for revenge didn't quite end as he'd expected. Poe sort of conditions me to think this way because there's almost always a cruel irony or twist of fate in store for his bad actors, but for Montresor, it doesn't seem there is such a thing, which again leaves me wondering if Fortunato really was in the wrong. I won't go on much longer about this one. I talked about a lot of its more interesting features when I ranked popular short stories from high school English class. You should check that video out, by the way. And as in that video, this story isn't quite the top banana. It'll come in number 2, and I think you all know why. We all know which of Edgar Allan Poe's works is reserved for number 1, even in a ranking of my own personal taste. The Raven is just a masterpiece. I won't read it in its entirety, it's long and you can hear other people do that. Let's just talk about a few of the things that make it so excellent. But what more can I say about this poem that hasn't already been said? Its construction is amazing. The rhyme and meter are so expertly crafted, the internal rhymes are so especially delicious. The poem is primarily written in trochaic octameter. A trochee is a pair of syllables where the first one is stressed and the second one is unstressed. It's the opposite of an iamb. And octameter means we have 8 trochees, ergo 16 syllables total. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary. And just listen to that alliteration, what a strong opening. As Wikipedia will tell you, another piece that uses trochaic octameter is Britney Spears' Womanizer, so now you know that you can sing The Raven in that tune. And in the case of The Raven, each stanza ends with 3.5 trochees, putting a nice bow on every stanza with a stressed syllable acting as a sure conclusion. One thing that always jumps out to me is how the speaker hears a knocking on his bedroom door and thinks it's a visitor. There's some comedy in that. It sort of makes you question how tired the speaker is, or if he's drunk or on drugs. Like, how could he think someone entered his home and would politely knock at his bedroom door? It's both funny and intriguing. It certainly reveals something about the speaker. There's also some humor in the back and forth the speaker has with the Raven. For as smart as this speaker apparently is, he can't seem to deduce that the Raven won't say anything other than nevermore. Like, come on dude, restructure your questions a bit. Although this again reveals something about the speaker, i.e. his stubbornness. But for all the humor in circumstance and premise, the poem's language makes it clear this is a tragedy more than a comedy. Then there's the bust of Athena, or Pallas in the poem's words, on which the Raven lands. According to PoeStories.com, Edgar Allan Poe chose Athena to demonstrate the speaker's scholarliness, but also because he really loved the sound of the word Pallas in the poem. And in taking the Raven as a symbol for the speaker's grief, we see how the sorrow of loss can overcome even the most astonishing wisdom and intellect. Cementing that idea is the implication at the end of the poem that the Raven stayed in place on Pallas's bust literally forever. And the Raven, never flitting, still is sitting, on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. When the speaker compares the Raven to a demon, it doesn't really sound like an exaggeration. The blackness of grief overcomes wisdom's purity, blocks the light, and casts a shadow that the grief-stricken cannot escape from. It's an unfortunately bleak ending, but one that sadly makes sense given Poe's life circumstances. And, as one of my patrons pointed out, that's part of why Poe really stands the test of time. It's not just that his stories are so uniquely macabre, it's the fact that his persona seemed so in line with those creations. There is so much mystique around Poe as a person, a mystique that matches his work. There's a reason he and his works persist. He oozes curiosity. Even middle schoolers can see that. But what do you think? Are you a fan of Poe? Do you love his work? Hate it? What do you think of this ranking? Please tell me everything. And hey, if you made it this far and if you like what I do, consider supporting my work on Patreon. You're seeing my patrons' names on screen right now, and as always, I genuinely can't thank them enough. If you want to support in non-monetary ways, please do all the things the algorithm likes, including hyping this video. You can also follow me on my socials if you want. But no matter what, keep reading, keep writing, and ultimately keep in mind, this is a rough draft. And for sticking around this long, here's one more Poe poem. 2. I heed not that my earthly lot hath little of earth in it, that years of love have been forgot in the hatred of a minute. I mourn not that the desolate are happier sweet than I, but that you sorrow for my fate, who am a passer-by.